91-year-old veteran faces 5 bikers. What happens next will leave you speechless. In the quiet town of Pinewood, a serene evening turned into an unforgettable showdown. Ron Harris, a 91-year-old war veteran, faced off against a gang of 5 intimidating bikers. The group mocked and encircled him, their taunts cutting through the night. But Ron, with the calm resolve of a soldier, didn't flinch. Instead, he made a single phone call that changed everything. Moments later, the bikers' smug grins faded as red and blue lights filled the street. What could one call from this elderly hero possibly summon that left these men trembling? But before we dive into this gripping story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories of courage and resilience, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more tales like this one. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long, golden streaks across the quiet streets of Pinewood. The faint hum of cicadas filled the warm evening air, mingling with the occasional chirp of birds. Ron Harris, a 91-year-old World War II veteran, walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk, his cane tapping a rhythmic beat against the pavement. Each step was deliberate, a testament to both his age and his unwavering determination. Ron had lived in Pinewood nearly all his life. It was a small town nestled in the Midwest, known for its close-knit community and tree-lined streets. To Ron, it was home, a place that held memories of triumphs, losses, and everything in between. A faded army cap sat snugly on his head, its embroidered battalion emblem dulled by decades of wear, but still a proud symbol of his service. Beneath the cap, his weathered face bore the lines of a life well lived. His pale blue eyes, though clouded slightly with age, still held a spark of vitality. Retirement had not been idle for Ron. Despite his age, he was a man of quiet action. Over the years, he had become a fixture in Pinewood's community, spearheading local charities and mentoring troubled youth. Though he moved slower now, his mind was as sharp as ever. People often said that Ron carried himself with a kind of gravity that made others straighten up in his presence. He was, after all, a man who had seen the worst of people. Tonight, as the last vestiges of sunlight bled into the sky, Ron made his way to the diner at the corner of Main Street. It was a routine he seldom broke. The Pinewood Diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a hub of camaraderie, a spot where stories were shared and connections forged over cups of coffee and slices of pie. For Ron, it was a place of solace. The gentle clink of his cane against the sidewalk harmonized with the distant hum of a street lamp buzzing to life. Ahead, the diner's neon sign flickered, a cheerful beacon in the approaching darkness. The word home was half lit, the mem stubbornly refusing to glow. Ron chuckled quietly to himself. Some things never changed. But then something did. The serenity of the evening shattered as the distant growl of engines pierced the air. Ron paused, his hand tightening on his cane. The sound grew louder, closer, until the peaceful hum of the town was replaced by a cacophony of roaring motors. 5 motorcycles burst onto the street, their riders clad in leather jackets and dark helmets. They rode like predators, weaving recklessly between the lanes as their laughter echoed against the storefronts. Ron resumed his walk, his eyes fixed forward, but his posture was a fraction more rigid. He had seen men like this before, not here in Pinewood, but in war zones and cities torn apart by chaos. Men who mistook noise and bravado for power. The lead biker, a wiry man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, steered his motorcycle dangerously close to Ron. The gust of wind from his passing made Ron's sleeve flutter. Startled, Ron stumbled but caught himself on his cane, his grip firm despite the tremor in his hand. "Careful, old man," the biker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Huh? Wouldn't want you falling into the street." The others howled with laughter, their engines revving in unison like a pack of wolves circling their prey. "Maybe we'd be doing him a favor," another biker shouted. His voice was sharp and cruel. "Nobody's gonna miss this relic." Ron straightened, his expression calm but unyielding. He didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of rattling him. His cane tapped the pavement once more as he resumed his pace, each step measured and resolute. But the bikers weren't done. They circled back, their tires screeching as they turned sharply to surround him. The street lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows over the scene. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of exhaust, and the rumble of their engines vibrated through the ground. One of the bikers leaned forward, his grin a mixture of malice and amusement. "What's the rush, Grandpa? Got a hot date at the bingo hall?" Ron paused, his eyes locking on the man. For a moment, the laughter faltered, and the bikers shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. "I've faced worse than you," Ron said, his voice steady and low. The lead biker chuckled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Oh yeah? What'd you fight, your arthritis?" The group erupted into laughter again, their jeers echoing down the empty street. But Ron didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the diner's neon sign flickered against the gathering dusk. The bikers revved their engines louder, their laughter growing more menacing. Ron tightened his grip on his cane, his knuckles whitening. Inside, he felt a familiar resolve building, a quiet but immovable force. He had learned long ago that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm in its face. The hum of engines surrounded him, the biker's laughter ringing in his ears. Yet Ron's eyes never wavered, and his heart beat with the rhythm of a soldier ready to face whatever came next. The roar of engines seemed to grow louder, their guttural snarl echoing through the quiet street. Ron's measured steps faltered as the bikers made a sharp U-turn, tires screeching against the asphalt. They came back toward him like a swarm of wasps, their laughter sharp and grating, cutting through the still evening air. As they drew closer, the 5 motorcycles fanned out, encircling Ron with mechanical precision. Each engine revved, a deafening chorus that sent vibrations through the ground and up Ron's legs. The acrid smell of exhaust hung thick in the air, stinging his nostrils and making his eyes water. The sharp scent of burnt rubber clung to the night, as if the air itself recoiled from their intrusion. The headlights of the bikes flared to life, casting long, twisting shadows that danced across the pavement. In their glaring beams, Ron's silhouette appeared smaller, more fragile, an aging man in the grip of a younger generation's menace. The bikers' voices rose above the thunder of their machines, taunting and cruel. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them jeered, his words dripping with derision. "What's with the hurry? Retirement home closing early tonight." Mitchell stood behind them, guarding the door. Their laughter exploded around him, sharp and vicious like the snap of a whip. Ron stopped walking, his feet planted firmly on the ground. His fingers tightened around the handle of his cane, but his posture remained composed. Though his eyes betrayed the flicker of fear, a deeply human response to the encroaching threat, his expression stayed calm, his face a mask of quiet determination. "Give it up, old man," another biker sneered. He twisted his throttle, making the bike roar like a wild animal. "You can't handle this road anymore. We own it now." Their bikes inched closer, engines growling in a threatening cadence. The circle tightened, shrinking the space around Ron until he could feel the heat radiating off their engines. Yet he didn't move. Instead, his eyes swept across the group, taking them in, one by one, memorizing faces obscured by helmets, voices laced with arrogance. Ron finally spoke, his voice steady, deliberate, cutting through the oppressive noise like a blade. "I've fought worse than you." For a moment there was silence, a pause so slight it could have been missed. One of the bikers, a lean man with a mocking grin and a glint of mischief in his eyes, leaned forward on his handlebars. His helmet reflected the glow of the streetlights as he gave a laugh that was more bark than mirth. "Oh yeah," the biker said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What'd you fight? Your arthritis?" The others howled in response, the circle shuddering with their cruel amusement. Their engines revved louder, each biker trying to outdo the others in a show of dominance. The sound bounced off the nearby buildings, amplifying their presence, making them feel like a force much larger than they were. Ron's jaw tightened ever so slightly, a subtle signal of his resolve. He adjusted his stance, his weight shifting slightly to balance against the vibrations shaking the ground beneath him. His grip on the cane never wavered. "Why don't we make this fun?" another biker called out, his voice tinged with a reckless edge. He twisted his handlebars, edging his front tire closer to Ron's foot. "Let's see how fast Grandpa can run." "Don't use Polly." But Ron didn't budge. His gaze didn't falter. The steady light of the street lamp overhead caught the glint in his eyes. A glint not of fear, but something else entirely. Something stronger. Something unshakable. The tension in the air thickened, almost tangible, as the bikers' laughter began to fade into an uneasy murmur. They could feel it, though they wouldn't admit it. A shift in the dynamic, a quiet strength emanating from the man in the circle. He hadn't run. He hadn't even flinched. The leader of the group, a scarred man with cold eyes, sneered and throttled his engine once more. "Looks like the old man thinks he's tough," he said, leaning forward until his face was level with Ron's. "Let's see how long that lasts." But Ron said nothing. He just stared back, his silence louder than any retort. In that moment, the bikers weren't sure who was circling whom. The air seemed to thicken as the bikers closed in tighter, their taunts giving way to something more sinister. The once distant sound of their laughter now rang sharp and oppressive, bouncing off the empty storefronts. With the circle tightening like a noose, it became clear that words were no longer enough to satisfy their appetite for intimidation. Without warning, two of the bikers dismounted their motorcycles, their boots clunking against the pavement. One, a wiry man with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, lunged forward and grabbed Ron's left arm. The other, stockier, with a jagged tattoo curling up his neck, seized his right. Their grips were firm, rough and unyielding, but Ron didn't struggle. His body tensed, his face flinching momentarily from the sharp pain in his shoulder. He winced, but refused to cry out. His silence only seemed to embolden them. "Got yourself a fighter, huh?" the wiry one said, grinning as he twisted Ron's arm slightly. "Bet you think you're real tough, huh, old man?" "Yeah," the stocky one chimed in, leaning close enough that Ron could smell the stale mix of beer and tobacco on his breath. "Bet you've never had to deal with a crew like ours." Still, Ron didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on the horizon, where the faint neon glow of the diner's sign flickered like a distant promise. His breath came heavier now, not from fear, but from the effort of containing the indignity boiling inside him. The sound of heavy boots echoed ominously as another figure approached. Lonus, the group's clear leader, strode forward with deliberate confidence. He towered over Ron, his broad shoulders clad in a weathered leather jacket that creaked faintly with each step. His face, marred by a deep scar slicing through his cheekbone, twisted into a cruel smirk. The man exuded menace, his presence amplifying the tension in the already oppressive circle. "Hold him steady," Lonus commanded, his voice low but filled with authority. The two bikers tightened their grips, jerking Ron slightly as Lonus stepped closer. His gloved hand shot out, grabbing the front of Ron's jacket and yanking it roughly. "Let's see what you're hiding," Lonus said, his voice dripping with mockery. His gloved fingers rummaged through Ron's pockets, the leather squeaking faintly with each movement. Finding little of value, he paused to tug at Ron's jacket zipper, his movements deliberate and invasive. His smirk widened as he leaned in, his scar catching the glow of the motorcycle's headlights. "What have you got, huh?" Lonus asked, sneering as he finally straightened. "A few bucks? Old-timers like you don't carry much these days." Ron's breathing remained steady, though his chest rose and fell slightly faster now. He met Lonus's gaze head-on, his voice steady and clear, despite the rough hand still pinning him in place. "You're right," Ron said, his tone calm but sharp as a blade. "I don't carry money, but you'll regret touching me." Henry walked away in one fast ball of motion, his back towards him. For a brief moment there was silence, the kind that made the night feel unnaturally still. Then, like a dam breaking, the bikers burst into uproarious laughter. "Ooh, scary," one of them jeered, his mocking tone cutting through the din. He was a lanky man perched lazily on his bike, idly flicking a blade open and closed. "Grandpa's threatening us? What are you gonna do, write us a letter?" The others howled in amusement, their laughter ringing out like a pack of hyenas. Even Lonus chuckled, shaking his head as he took a step back. But Ron didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Lonus, his gaze unbroken, unwavering. There was no anger, no pleading, just a quiet resolve that somehow cut through the biker's mockery like a knife. It was enough to make the smirks falter, just slightly, as unease rippled through the group. Lonus narrowed his eyes, his amusement fading into something harder, more calculating. "You think you're smarter than us, don't you?" Lonus asked, his voice colder now, his smirk gone. He took a step forward again, his gloved hand resting on Ron's shoulder. "Let me tell you something, old man. Out here, respect doesn't come free. You've got to earn it." Ron's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, but the tension in his body spoke volumes. Lonus's fingers dug into his shoulder briefly before he released him with a shove. The other two bikers let go as well, stepping back with smirks that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Let's take this up a notch," Lonus said, turning toward his bike with a dangerous gleam in his eye. "We're just getting started." As the group regrouped, revving their engines again, Ron remained where he stood, his figure a stark silhouette against the glow of the headlights. His breathing was heavier now, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, but his gaze stayed steady. He had faced worse than this before, and deep down, he knew they wouldn't break him. The air hung heavy with tension as Lonus yanked Ron's arm roughly, his grip unrelenting. "Move it, old man," he growled, shoving Ron forward to lead the group. The other bikers roared with laughter, their boots scuffing against the asphalt as they followed. The engines of their motorcycles growled low and menacing, a constant reminder of their presence. It was on the presence of these monsters hovering in the distance that Lonus noticed a rolling star through the sky. Ron stumbled slightly, but caught himself with his cane, his jaw tightening. Each step forward was slow and deliberate, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of will it took to maintain his composure. The flickering neon sign of the diner ahead caught his eye. The word "home" blinked inconsistently, its burnt-out bulbs adding to the diner's worn charm. For Ron, it was more than a destination. It was a place of familiarity and refuge, but now it loomed like a battleground. Lonus, towering over Ron even from behind, leaned close enough that Ron could feel his hot breath. "Let's see if you're man enough to buy us dinner, old man," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Ron didn't look back. His grip on the cane tightened as he spoke, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I've faced real enemies," he said through gritted teeth. "You're just cowards with loud toys." The bikers halted for a split second, their laughter stifling into an awkward pause before Biker 1 barked out a response. "Keep talking, and we'll make sure you never walk again." His voice was sharp, tinged with frustration that the old man wasn't crumbling as expected. The group resumed their march, shoving Ron whenever his pace slowed. Lonus gave a particularly hard push, causing Ron to stagger briefly. But even then, the veteran's shoulders remained squared, his gaze fixed on the glowing sign ahead. Inside the diner, he knew there were familiar faces. Claire, the young waitress who always greeted him warmly, and the regulars who filled the booths with the comfortable hum of small-town chatter. He didn't want them caught up in this, but his options were limited. As they approached, the scene inside the diner began to shift. The patrons, previously engrossed in their meals, turned toward the windows. Their faces were a mix of concern and uncertainty as they watched the group approaching. Some stood, their movements hesitant, while others whispered anxiously to one another. Claire hovered near the counter, her notepad clutched tightly to her chest. The fluorescent lights overhead cast stark shadows on her face, highlighting the fear etched into her features. Ron's breathing grew heavier as they reached the door, but his eyes remained calm. He could feel the weight of the bikers behind him, their laughter and taunts echoing in his ears, but he didn't let it show. To them, he was just an old man, an easy target. They had no idea what he'd been through, no concept of the strength it took to endure. Bonus yanked the diner door open with a loud creak, motioning for Ron to step inside. "After you, Grandpa," he said with mock courtesy, his smirk widening as the other bikers chuckled. Ron stepped through the doorway, his cane tapping against the tiled floor. The once familiar diner felt different now, the warm hum of conversation replaced by a charged silence. All eyes were on him and the bikers as they filed in behind him, their heavy boots and leather jackets clashing against the diner's homely atmosphere. Lonus clapped a hand on Ron's shoulder, shoving him toward an empty booth near the back. "Sit tight," he ordered before turning to Claire. "We're gonna need a table for 6. And make it quick." Claire hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice wavering. Lonus smirked. "Oh, everything's fine. Grandpa here's treating us, isn't that right?" He shot a pointed glance at Ron. Ron met his gaze evenly, his voice calm and steady. "Just get me a coffee." "Black." "Coffee?" Lonus repeated with mock surprise, turning back to Claire. "And burgers for the rest of us, top shelf. Don't forget the pie." His grin widened as the bikers erupted into laughter, but the tension in the room only deepened. Behind the counter, Claire nodded stiffly, her eyes darting toward Ron as if silently asking if she should call for help. Ron's calm demeanor didn't waver, though his jaw clenched slightly. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The diner door slammed shut behind the bikers, the metallic clang ringing through the space and silencing the soft murmur of conversation. Heads turned as the group stormed in, their presence overwhelming the cozy diner like a sudden storm cloud. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their cold white glow casting stark shadows on the tiled floor. Ron ushered in first, steadied himself with his cane as Lonus gave him a hard shove toward an empty booth in the back corner. The air felt heavy, thick with the nervous tension that now gripped the room. Customers exchanged uncertain glances, some lowering their eyes to avoid drawing attention. Others sat frozen, their utensils suspended midair. It wasn't often that trouble like this found its way into Pinewood, let alone the diner, a place synonymous with comfort and community. Claire, the young waitress, hesitated near the counter. Her fingers clutched her notepad tightly, her knuckles white against the worn leather. She was used to serving up smiles and coffee refills, not navigating situations like this. The bikers, with their leather jackets and brazen laughter, seemed to suck all the warmth out of the room. Lonus leaned casually against the booth, his towering frame making the space feel even smaller. "Get comfortable, old man," he sneered, jerking his thumb at the seat. "You're hosting tonight." Ron, refusing to be rattled, straightened his cap before lowering himself into the booth. The bikers followed suit, spilling into the surrounding seats and leaning over the table with an air of possession. Their movements were loud, deliberate, a show of force meant to unnerve everyone present. Claire took a tentative step forward, her eyes flickering between Ron and the group of bikers. Her voice, usually so confident as she called out orders to the kitchen, now wavered. Is everything okay here?" Lonus turned to her, his grin all teeth. "Yeah, it's fine," he said, his tone mockingly cheerful. "Grandpa here's treating us, isn't that right?" He leaned toward Ron, his grin widening as the other bikers chuckled in agreement. Ron met Linus's gaze with a steady calm that seemed to deflate some of the bravado in the room. "Claire," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "Just get me a coffee. Black." Claire hesitated, as if trying to gauge whether there was more to his words, before nodding quickly. She turned toward the counter, but didn't make it far. "And burgers," Lonus called after her, his voice loud enough to fill the diner. "For all of us, top shelf stuff. Don't forget the pie." His words dripped with entitlement, and the group burst into laughter again, their voices a grating chorus that contrasted sharply with the normally peaceful hum of the diner. Claire's hands shook slightly as she scribbled the order down, the pen scratching against the notepad louder than it should have been. She shot another glance toward Ron, as if silently asking for reassurance, but his expression remained composed, almost defiant in its calm. The tension in the room only thickened. A man seated at the counter shifted in his stool, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. Another customer whispered hurriedly to his companion, their words lost beneath the low rumble of nervous conversation. Ron, meanwhile, sat unmoving, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. He appeared unaffected by the biker's antics, though his knuckles whitened slightly where his hand gripped the cane resting beside him. If he felt anger or fear, he didn't show it. One of the bikers leaned across the table, his leather jacket creaking as he shoved Ron's empty mug slightly forward. "You better not go cheap on us, old-timer," he said with a smirk. "We've got appetites, you know." Ron's response was calm, measured. "Enjoy the meal while you can," he said simply, his eyes not leaving the bikers. There was no malice in his tone, but there was something in his words, a weight, a promise, that made the man hesitate for a fraction of a second before laughing it off. Claire returned moments later, setting Ron's coffee down on the table with trembling hands. Lonis slapped his hand down hard on the table, making her jump and spill a few drops of the steaming liquid. "Careful, sweetheart," he said, his grin turning predatory. "Wouldn't want to ruin the old man's treat." The din of the biker's laughter filled the diner again, but the unease in the room had reached a breaking point. As Claire backed away, her eyes flickered once more toward Ron. He gave her the smallest of nods, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. The bikers may have thought they had control of the situation, but Ron knew better, and deep down, Claire suspected it too. Something was coming. Something they wouldn't see until it was too late. The tension in the diner was as thick as the smell of frying burgers wafting from the kitchen. Claire, her notepad now forgotten in her apron, emerged from behind the counter with a steaming mug of coffee. Her steps were hesitant, her heart hammering in her chest as she approached the table. The bikers leaned back in their seats, smirking as they watched her every move, their predatory energy filling the small space. She set the coffee down gently in front of Ron, her hands trembling just enough to make the liquid ripple in the cup. "Here you go," she said softly, almost as if trying not to disturb the fragile calm that hung in the air. Ron gave her a small nod of gratitude, his weathered face calm despite the hostility radiating around him. Before Ron could even reach for the mug, Lonis's hand shot out, slamming down onto the table with a force that made the dishes rattle. The motion sent the coffee splashing across the surface, dark streaks spreading like ink on the wood. Claire gasped, taking a step back. "Hey," she snapped, surprising even herself. "He paid for that." Lonis turned his gaze toward her, his grin twisting into a snarl. So," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "He can buy another." Her hand reached out to trace his lips, and he nodded once. Ron remained unmoved, his expression unchanged as he reached for a napkin to dab at the spilled coffee. His deliberate calm only seemed to infuriate Lonis further. The biker leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the table. "What's the matter, old man? Nothing to say?" Before Ron could respond, a voice from across the diner broke through the tension. "Leave him alone." All heads turned toward the counter, where a man in his early 40s stood. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but his clenched fists and narrowed eyes showed he wasn't backing down. The room collectively held its breath as the man stepped forward, his jaw tight with determination. Lonis straightened, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. He glanced at his crew, who chuckled darkly in response. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Lonis said, his tone mocking. "But I'd think twice if I were you." The room grew impossibly still as one of the bikers, a wiry man with a mean grin, reached into his jacket. A glint of steel caught the fluorescent light as he pulled out a knife and flicked it open with a practiced flick of his wrist. He pointed the blade at the man by the counter, the smirk never leaving his face. "Sit down," the biker hissed, his voice dripping with menace, "unless you want to lose a finger." The man hesitated, his bravado wavering as the threat became all too real. Slowly, he stepped back toward his stool, raising his hands in a gesture of reluctant surrender. The bikers laughed again, their jeers filling the diner and pushing the tension higher. Claire stood frozen, her eyes wide and darting between the bikers, Ron, and the rest of the patrons, all of whom seemed paralyzed with fear. But Ron remained as steady as a mountain. His silence, far from a sign of submission, was like the calm before a storm. Lonis turned his attention back to Ron, slapping the table again with a smirk. "Looks like you've got yourself some fans, old man," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Too bad they don't have the guts to back you up." Ron lifted his eyes slowly, meeting Lonis's gaze. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet, unyielding resolve that made Lonis's smirk falter ever so slightly. And though Ron hadn't said a word, there was something in his expression that sent a ripple of unease through the group. The bikers didn't notice it yet, but the tide was beginning to turn. Ron sat quietly for a moment, the faint clinking of a fork against a plate and the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the silence. The bikers leaned back in their seats, emboldened by the submission of the man at the counter and the lack of intervention from the other patrons. Lonis watched Ron intently, his smirk returning as he tapped his fingers on the edge of the table. "You're awfully quiet for someone with so much fight in him," Lonis taunted. "Don't tell me you've given up already." Without a word, Ron slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, and far too composed to be an act of surrender. His hand emerged holding an old, slightly scuffed smartphone. The glow from its screen lit up his weathered features as he swiped to unlock it. Its electronic button was seen to fly apart when wheeled on. The bikers exchanged puzzled glances, their earlier bravado dimming slightly. Lonis's brow furrowed as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Ron didn't answer. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts with the same deliberate slowness, his thumb pausing on one entry. The name Mayer appeared clearly on the screen, its bold letters unmistakable even from across the table. The flicker of unease in Lonis's expression deepened, and he glanced at the other bikers, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Wait, the mayor?" Lonis said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What kind of game are you playing, old man?" Ron raised the phone to his ear and waited as the line connected. His gaze stayed locked on Lonis, his calm demeanor as steady as ever. When the call was answered, he spoke in measured tones, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room. "It's me," Ron said, his tone calm but resolute. "I need a favor. At the diner. Bring everyone." The simplicity of his words sent a chill through the air. Ron ended the call without waiting for a response, lowering the phone to the table with the same deliberate movements. The room was silent, save for the faint creak of a chair as one of the bikers leaned forward. "What's that supposed to mean?" one of the bikers demanded, his voice tinged with unease. Ron's gaze didn't waver. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied, his voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had nothing to prove. Lonis's smirk had faded entirely, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. He glanced at the phone again, then back at Ron, as if trying to piece together what he'd just witnessed. "You think we're scared of a phone call?" Lonis barked, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "You're bluffing." Ron didn't respond. He simply leaned back in the booth, his grip steady on his cane. His calm presence was unnerving, even to men who thrived on intimidation. Minutes ticked by, the bikers exchanging nervous glances. The room was tense, the silence punctuated only by the occasional scrape of a chair or the faint sound of someone clearing their throat. Outside, the faint wail of sirens began to rise in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Lonus's head snapped toward the window, his face paling as flashing red and blue lights reflected off the glass. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, standing abruptly. Ron remained seated, his eyes still on Lonus. "I told you," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. "You'd regret touching me." The wail of sirens shattered the tense silence, growing louder as they approached the diner. Heads turned toward the windows as flashing red and blue lights strobed through the glass, their brilliance cutting through the dim interior. The bikers, who had been so loud and boisterous moments ago, suddenly froze in their seats. Outside, the screech of tires signaled the abrupt arrival of several police cars. Doors flew open, and uniformed officers poured out with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed drill. Their weapons gleamed under the harsh lights of the diner's parking lot as they moved swiftly toward the entrance, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the floor. The heavy diner door swung open with force, slamming against the wall as the officers entered. The room seemed to shrink under their presence, their authority filling the space and cutting through the oppressive atmosphere the bikers had created. "Hands on the table, now!" barked the lead officer, his voice sharp and commanding. He moved with precision, scanning the room as his team spread out behind him, covering all exits. The bikers hesitated, their bravado crumbling in an instant. Lonus, usually the picture of control, looked to his crew, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice losing its edge. "Do it!" the officer shouted again, raising his weapon slightly as his gaze locked on Lonus. The bikers, now visibly rattled, slowly complied, placing their hands on the sticky diner tables. Their movements were sluggish and reluctant, the reality of the situation dawning on them. Claire, still standing near the counter, let out a shaky breath of relief. She clutched her apron tightly, her eyes darting between Ron and the officers. The other patrons remained rooted in their seats, some peeking cautiously over booths, others watching wide-eyed as the scene unfolded. Ron, however, sat unmoving, his demeanor unchanged. His cane rested by his side, and his expression carried the same quiet resolve he had worn throughout the night. It was as though the chaos unfolding around him was a mere echo of a battle he'd fought many times before. Lonus's panic was beginning to show. "We didn't even do anything," he blurted out, his voice cracking as he stared at the officers closing in. His fingers twitched slightly, a nervous gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Ron's gaze shifted toward Lonus, and for the first time that evening, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. His voice, calm and deliberate, broke the momentary silence. "Not yet," he said, "but you were about to." The weight of Ron's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Lonus opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. He looked away, avoiding Ron's steady gaze, as though it held the truth he didn't want to confront. After a few moments, he spoke confidently, calling off his distraction to face the man who had put him through so much. The lead officer gestured toward Lonus and the others. "On your feet," he commanded. Slowly. The bikers complied, their movements stiff and reluctant. As they stood, the officers moved in, cuffing them one by one with practiced efficiency. The sound of metal clicking into place echoed through the room, a sharp contrast to the muffled murmurs of the patrons. Lonus, now restrained, turned back to Ron, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. But Ron didn't answer. He simply watched as the bikers were led toward the door, the flashing lights outside illuminating their stunned faces. "Because of me?" she quipped. "He has always been my best friend." The officers' shadows stretched long across the floor, mingling with the dim glow of the diner's neon sign. The scene felt almost surreal, a sudden reversal of power that left the bikers stripped of their arrogance and swagger. As the last of the bikers was escorted out, the lead officer approached Ron. "You okay, sir?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost reverent. Ron nodded, his expression calm. "I am now," he replied simply, leaning slightly on his cane as he stood. "Thank you." The officer tipped his hat in acknowledgement before turning to oversee the scene outside. The diner was quiet again, the tension that had gripped it now replaced with a sense of relief. Ron, ever composed, took one last glance at the flashing lights outside before settling back into his seat. The storm had passed, and for the first time that evening, peace returned to Pinewood. The commotion outside had begun to settle. The bikers, now cuffed and subdued, stood awkwardly near the squad cars as the officers finalized their reports. Inside the diner, the patrons remained seated, their gazes fixed on Ron, who sat composed at his booth. The tension that had dominated the evening lingered in the air, but it was no longer oppressive. Instead, it was replaced by something quieter: curiosity, respect, and a sense that something remarkable was about to unfold. The sound of footsteps drew everyone's attention to the door. It opened slowly, revealing a tall, distinguished man in a tailored suit. The mayor of Pinewood stepped inside, his presence commanding yet dignified. Flanking him were the police chief and a local reporter, her cameras slung over her shoulder. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the trio entered, their arrival bringing an unexpected gravity to the already charged atmosphere. The bikers, still visible through the diner's large windows, shrank visibly under the weight of the mayor's appearance. Even Lonis, who had maintained some semblance of defiance, looked suddenly smaller, his bravado crumbling like a poorly built facade. His eyes darted between the mayor, the police chief, and Ron. Confusion and unease etched across his scarred face. The mayor's gaze swept across the room before settling on Ron. A warm smile broke through his otherwise serious expression, and he stepped forward, his voice carrying a tone of deep respect. "Ron," he said, his words measured and sincere, "are you all right? These men will pay for what they've done." The room was silent save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Ron looked up at the mayor, his expression softening slightly. With a small nod, he replied, "I'm fine, Mayor. Thank you for coming." The mayor turned toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the cuffed bikers outside. "Good," he said firmly. "It's about time someone taught them a lesson." Linus, unable to contain his growing panic, stammered, Who is he?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his mounting fear. He glanced around the room, searching for an answer that no one seemed eager to provide. It was one of the officers standing near the booth who finally broke the silence. His voice carried a quiet reverence as he addressed Lannis directly. "Ron isn't just anyone," the officer began, his words cutting through the room like a knife. "He's a war hero, fought in World War II, saved his entire unit when their position was overrun." The officer paused, his gaze flicking to Ron before continuing. "But that's not all. When he came back, he didn't stop fighting for people. He saved half this town with his charity work, paid for the new community center, funded scholarships for kids who couldn't afford school. He even paid for my training at the academy." The officer's voice tightened with emotion. "And he's the one who backed the mayor's campaign when no one else believed in him." The weight of the officer's words hung heavily in the air. The bikers stood frozen, their earlier confidence obliterated. Lonis's face was a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The mayor turned to face Lonis, his expression hardening. "No one's kidding," he said, his voice sharp. "And you had the audacity to try to rob him, harass him?" He gestured to Ron. "This man built this town more than anyone else here. You should be ashamed." The reporter, who had been silently observing, raised her camera and began snapping photos of the scene. Her lens captured everything: the humbled bikers, the resolute mayor, and Ron, who sat quietly, his cane resting by his side, his calm demeanor unshaken. Lonis opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked utterly defeated. The other bikers avoided eye contact entirely, their earlier arrogance now replaced with palpable shame. Lonas felt everyone soaking up the tension. The police chief, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Take them to the station," he ordered his officers. "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." He turned to face me. As the bikers were escorted out, the mayor turned back to Ron. "If there's anything else you need, anything at all, just say the word," he said, his tone gentle. Ron gave a faint smile. "You've done more than enough," he replied. "But thank you." The mayor nodded, and with that, the tension in the room finally began to ease. The patrons, still processing what they had witnessed, slowly resumed their conversations. But the respect in their eyes, as they looked at Ron, was unmistakable. He wasn't just an old man. They now knew he was a living legend. The red and blue lights painted the street outside the diner, their rhythmic flashing a stark reminder of the night's events. The bikers, subdued and cuffed, were led one by one toward the waiting police cars. Their heads hung low, their earlier swagger and defiance completely stripped away. The once loud group had been reduced to silence, their fate now sealed in the hands of the law. Standing just beyond the edge of the police perimeter was another figure, his imposing silhouette partially obscured by the shadows of the streetlights. The gang leader, a man known only as Slate, watched the scene unfold with a face like stone. His leather jacket hung heavily on his broad shoulders, and his arms remained crossed as his eyes followed each of his men being loaded into the squad cars. The air outside felt colder now, the adrenaline of the conflict giving way to a strange stillness. Slate's gaze finally shifted to Ron, who stood in the diner doorway, cane in hand, watching the proceedings with a quiet authority that spoke louder than any words could. As the last of the bikers was shoved into the car, Slate stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The officers glanced at him warily, but didn't interfere. This wasn't their fight anymore. "You embarrassed us," Slate said, his voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of suppressed fury. He looked at the patrol cars, then back at Ron. "They're done. Don't come back." Ron's eyes met Slate's, and for a moment neither man moved. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. The quiet stretched between them until Ron finally broke it. "Make sure they learn," Ron said, his voice calm but resolute. He stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "This town doesn't tolerate cowards." Slate didn't reply right away. His expression remained unreadable as he studied Ron, his face betraying neither defiance nor submission. Finally, with a slow nod, Slate stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. The air around him seemed to shift, carrying with it the weight of an unspoken understanding. The patrol cars pulled away, their lights fading into the distance. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their glow returning to a steadier rhythm. The night began to reclaim its calm, but for those who had witnessed the events in the diner, the evening's impact lingered like the fading echoes of a storm. Inside, the patrons slowly began to relax, their whispered conversations breaking the silence. Claire approached Ron, her expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked softly. Ron nodded, his weathered face offering a small, reassuring smile. "I've been through worse," he said, his tone light, though the weight of his words was not lost on her. The mayor, who had lingered near the counter, stepped forward. "You didn't just stand up for yourself tonight," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "You reminded this town what it means to have courage, to do the right thing." Ron tipped his cap slightly, his way of acknowledging the praise without basking in it. "It's not about being fearless," he said after a pause. "It's about standing firm even when fear is staring you in the face." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. One by one, the patrons began to approach Ron, offering quiet words of gratitude and admiration. Even the man who had tried to intervene earlier approached, his expression sheepish. "I wish I'd done more," he admitted. "You stood up," Ron replied simply. "That's where it starts." As the diner began to empty, Ron remained in his booth, savoring the moment of peace. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows that stretched down the empty street, a reminder of the night's trials. The town was quiet again, but it felt different somehow. Stronger, more connected. As Ron finally rose to leave, Claire stopped him at the door. "Ron," she said hesitantly, "how do you do it? Stay so calm when everything's falling apart." He paused, leaning slightly on his cane. "You don't fight battles with noise or rage," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You fight them with purpose. And you never forget who you're standing for." Claire nodded, her expression thoughtful as she watched him step into the night. The shadows of the streetlights danced around him as he walked slowly home, his silhouette blending into the stillness of Pinewood. And as the town settled back into its quiet rhythm, those who had witnessed the evening's events were left with more than just a story to tell. They were left with a question, one that would echo in their hearts for days to come. When the moment comes, will I stand for what's right? The answer, as Ron had shown them, was not in the noise of the moment, but in the quiet strength of the choice. The days following the confrontation at the diner passed quietly, but something had shifted in Pinewood. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, the hum of conversations at the diner, children playing on the streets, and the comforting monotony of small-town life. Yet, Ron's name was on everyone's lips. Stories of his calm defiance and unshakable strength spread quickly, weaving their way into the fabric of the town's collective memory. For many, it wasn't just what Ron had done that stuck with them, but how he had done it. His resolve, his unflinching dignity in the face of cruelty, became an inspiration. The tale of the 91-year-old war hero who stared down a gang of bikers became more than a story. It became a legend, a reminder of what true courage looked like. The community responded in quiet but profound ways. Ron's evening strolls were no longer solitary. Often he would find someone waiting outside his home, ready to join him on his walk to the diner. Some evenings it was Claire, her notepad tucked away, eager to share stories and laughter. Other times it was the man from the counter, now more confident and determined to stood up when it mattered. Even the mayor walked beside Ron once, the two of them discussing the future of the town. The diner became a symbol of the town's resilience. Its neon sign, still flickering slightly, now seemed to represent more than just a place to grab a meal. It was a beacon of community, of strength, and of belonging. Whenever Ron entered, the conversations would briefly hush before erupting in warm greetings, people vying to pay for his coffee or share a moment with him. One evening, as Ron sat in his usual booth, staring out at the fading sunset, Claire slid into the seat across from him. "Does it ever get old?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. "Being the town's hero?" Ron chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero," he replied. "I just did what needed to be done." She tilted her head, studying him. "You stood for all of us that night. I think that makes you one." Ron's gaze drifted to the horizon, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice steady and reflective. "It's not the battles you win that define you," he said. "It's the people you stand for." The words lingered in the air, their simplicity carrying a profound weight. Claire nodded, her smile softening, and for a moment they sat in companionable silence, the glow of the diner's lights spilling onto the quiet street outside. As the town continued to hum with life, Ron's quiet strength served as a reminder to everyone. True courage wasn't about making noise or seeking glory. It was about standing firm, protecting what mattered, and walking forward, no matter how heavy the burden.